I'm Dr. Adonia Lugo, and I'm really excited to be here as a speaker today. I am the Interim Program Chair of the Urban Sustainability Department at Antioch University Los Angeles. But in the past, I taught here at Cal State LA, and I think this is a really great community, and it's great to have an opportunity to be back on campus. So I want to tell you a little bit about my background as a cultural anthropologist and then get into the content of my talk today. So I got my PhD from UC Irvine back in 2013, and as a graduate student, I ended up focusing primarily on transportation and specifically looking at the intersections of race and class and transportation. And how is it that here in Southern California, we are engaging in a lot of different kind of messaging as we're out there traveling. So from a sustainability standpoint, you might think this is a really good region for using low carbon transportation, such as biking and walking and public transit. But those modes of transportation are heavily stigmatized in this region. We have a long history of investing more in highways and roads for private automobiles than we do in mass transit systems. And what I started encountering when I became a bicycle commuter in the LA area in 2007 was that being out there on a bicycle, you're kind of disrupting things. You're not acting the way that you're supposed to. And that's what really got me thinking about this stuff. And the fact that there were people like me who were bicycling because we thought it was a good thing for the environment or for ecological reasons. But the majority of people who ride bikes in LA and actually around the country are doing it because they don't have other options. It's the only thing they can afford. And so as an anthropologist, what we focus on in my field is the cultural side of things, the human side of things, and how it is that the attitudes and cultural values that we get raised with shape our understanding of the world around us. And so over the course of doing my PhD work, I ended up developing into a certain kind of voice within the bicycle movement and around sustainable transportation as a whole, looking at these race and class questions and how do we do more to take them into account with planning for sustainable transportation systems in the future. So that's a little preface about me. As I said, I'm over at Antioch University Los Angeles, which is in Culver City. I was born and raised in San Juan Capistrano down in South Orange County. I identify as Chicana, mixed race, Mexican American. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation here. So, infrastructure systems that we're interacting with on a daily basis, but not necessarily thinking about too much, we tend to talk about those and relate to them from an urban planning standpoint as physical systems, right? So you might be thinking about transmission lines where electricity is traveling, or aqueducts that are bringing water into the region, or our sewer systems, which are very important for making sure that we have sanitation in our dense urban environments. But what I have found, and a lot of other researchers looking at the life cycle of infrastructure systems have found, is that there are also social components to infrastructure. Not only are they something we're interacting with every day, they're designed by people, they're maintained by people. And sometimes when they fall apart because of a disaster or because of political turmoil or whatever's going on, people end up having to step in and kind of play the role of infrastructure in different ways just to get their needs met and take care of their families and communities. So for a number of years, there have been scholars writing about concepts of the social side of infrastructure, or what does it mean to look at infrastructure as something social. And the image I put in here is from a mural by Diego Rivera that's in Mexico City that I don't think you can see the detail too good in this image, it's a little dark, but within this mural there are many components, and a lot of it has to do with kind of looking at how does life and industry and culture and politics, how does all that stuff fit together? And Rivera was one of a number of muralists who were very interested in promoting workers and moving toward a more equitable landscape in terms of people getting paid for their work and ownership of industry and things like that. So I think it's just a good image that illustrates a little bit how this stuff is intertwined. You can't really think about people systems as separate than these big industrial systems. So, since my focus area is primarily transportation or mobility, let's think about what some different mobility infrastructures are that we're familiar with. This is an image from that same trip to Mexico City I took in 2017, and you've got a roadway, you've got train infrastructure there. I'm on a bicycle and pedestrian overpass that takes you over this big highway. So oftentimes when transportation infrastructure and transportation systems come up, these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. These large-scale, developed, physical infrastructures that allow us to get from point A to point B. What I have focused on primarily is, as I said, the human side of things and how it is that people actually relate in those street spaces and how we carry certain ideas with us as we travel. So I work with the concept of human infrastructure, and what this image here is about is that when we're talking about a particular person's trip, so maybe someone's commute or the trip that they take to run errands or that sort of thing, typically in transportation studies, the approach is to, again, focus very much on the built environment. How is that person traversing the built environment? What are the types of infrastructure that they're encountering? But from the research that I've done, focusing more on different kinds of road users and different modes of transportation people might be using in the same street spaces, I've been one of a number of scholars who actually think we need to make it a little more complicated than that. Clearly, the built environment is part of what your trip is going to be like, but there are other components involved as well. You have a kind of vehicle you might be operating, or maybe you're just walking on your own 2 feet. Maybe you're on an electric scooter. Maybe you're in a like carpool or rideshare van or something like that. That's going to shape how you're experiencing that built environment. And then you're in a particular kind of body, and we're not in the same kinds of bodies. There are a lot of differences in how each of us is allowed to travel, or the kinds of limitations on our travel that we might encounter based on who we are in terms of these social categories of race and gender, class. There are issues around ability. If you're someone who is a wheelchair user, then absolutely you're not going to be encountering the built environment in the same way that I am as someone who, is able to get around on my 2 feet. So the human infrastructure idea is that there's more going on than just the built environment. And if we're interested in figuring out how to make our our transportation systems more sustainable, then we need to look at these human elements as well. We need to look at the social and cultural stuff that shapes our travel choices, in addition to trying to make those physical systems more sustainable. So I've been involved for the last, how many years? 3 years in an advocacy and urban planning conversation around this concept of mobility justice. And that has been a way for me as a scholar to be talking with folks who are advocating for safer streets in their communities, or who are trying to figure out how to make improvements to our neighborhoods without just immediately helping to contribute to displacement and gentrification and things like that. There's a bunch of us who want to challenge the kind of way that transportation planning has been done in our country. And from my perspective, it really is a project of creating a human infrastructure conversation. Like, we're trying to highlight that there's more going on in the street, and there's more going on when we're traveling than just those concrete elements that have historically been the way that we relate to transportation. So this is an image from a group called People for Mobility Justice, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, that I think illustrates all of these different things that come together in the conversation of mobility justice. So in terms of the history of justice movements and transportation, there is a long history in this country of a project called environmental justice. How many of you are familiar with environmental justice? Ever heard that term? So environmental justice is a project that started really in the 1980s, when communities who were experiencing a lot of harm because of pollution, because they had big factories or different kinds of trash processing facilities right in their neighborhoods. And researchers started finding that sometimes there were hot spots where a bunch of folks were getting cancer, or a bunch of children were getting asthma. And it was because of this exposure that they had to these harmful, polluting institutions right there at home. Here in LA, we have a lot of examples of those kind of environmental justice issues. For example, close by in Boyle Heights in East LA, there has been a problem for a long time with an old battery factory that let a lot of chemicals leach into the soil. And so there's a lot of homes in the area that actually have toxic soil. So families shouldn't be growing any food there. Kids are getting exposed when they're out there playing. And that's just one example. We have a lot of examples like that. So the environmental justice movement really gained steam in the 1990s and started identifying a lot of these kinds of cases around the country, and also just made this really strong connection between environmentalism, which is about trying to protect the earth, trying to protect our natural systems, making a connection between that and urban communities. Because for a lot of the 20th century, when people would talk about environmentalism or conservation, they'd really be talking about spaces outside of cities. They meant national forests, national parks. The idea was that we needed to preserve these spaces away from cities because our cities are just these, dirty, bad, corrupted, polluted zones. And what the environmental justice movement, activists from these different communities who started networking across the country, what they said to that was, well, wait a second, our primary environment is where we live. It's where we live, it's where we work, it's where we play. So it's not just a matter of making sure that environmental conditions are protected away in these national parks that maybe people in our communities never even get to go to. We also need to make sure that our schools are safe environments and healthy environments. We need to make sure that people have access to housing where they're not going to be poisoned just by, using yard space. So the environmental justice movement is something that's been really influential for a lot of other urban social movements since the 90s. And so something that developed here in LA, specifically making a connection between environmental justice and transportation, is a group called the Bus Riders Union, which got formed in the mid-90s because they felt that Metro, our transit authority, was not actually working to serve the needs of bus riders. And one of their primary concerns is that, if you're a bus rider in LA, that shouldn't be a surprise to you that actually Metro is not that concerned about serving your needs as a bus rider. But their big issue in the 90s was that Metro was starting to invest money in building out the rail system. So at that time, the only rail line that had been built was the Blue Line out to Long Beach. And they were just starting to do construction on the Purple Line and the Red Line and all that kind of stuff. So this group, the Bus Riders Union, said, well, wait a second, you're taking all this money from bus service, you're actually cutting bus lines in order to spend money on these train systems, but actually the people who are riding the buses are primarily people of color. And so they actually managed to sue Metro under the Civil Rights Act, which says that federal money cannot be distributed in a way that has a disproportionately negative effect on communities of color. Race is one of what are called protected categories, where money from the government is not supposed to be used in ways that are going to benefit one group more than another. So they actually were able to get a federal judge to say that they were right and that Metro was discriminating. And so for a number of years, the Bus Riders Union was able to have an impact on making sure that there was better bus service in LA. They played a big role in getting Metro to shift toward natural gas buses so that there would be less emissions from buses. And the Bus Riders Union is the major reason why bus fares are still as low as they are in LA. I don't know how many of you are bus riders, but it's $1.75 to do a one-way trip on Metro. And that's really cheap relative to how much it costs in other US cities. That is really cheap. And it was actually only $1.25 up until I think 2011. And that was just, unheard of. All other major US cities, it's at least $2. So, so here in LA, we have this really strong legacy of making a connection between what's happening with our transportation systems and how that relates to this legacy of structural inequality we have around race and class. So that area gets referred to as transportation justice. So transportation justice grew out of environmental justice, and then where we are today is talking about mobility justice, because something that ended up happening with the idea of transportation justice is that they ended up focusing a lot on, again, things like the actual physical infrastructure of a city and how transportation systems were serving or not serving low-income people and people of color. And something happened in 2014 that really highlighted to a number of us who were working on promoting sustainable transportation, things like bicycling and walking, that when this thing happened, we really started to question a lot of how much of a focus there was on these built systems within transportation advocacy. And what happened was the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. So in 2014, there were a number of very high-profile instances of either black men and boys getting murdered by police or court cases that were acquitting police officers or other people of shooting and killing black men and boys. And so for the first time in my life, I started seeing all over the news, well, I guess actually I was alive in 1992, so it was around the news then too. But anyway, for the first time in a long time, this issue of police violence, specifically against black communities, was, being talked about all over the place. It was a really big deal. And so for those of us who were working on street safety issues in bicycling and walking and things like that, we couldn't help but see a connection between one kind of safety and another kind of safety. So for example, in the world of trying to make safer streets, usually when we say safe, what we're referring to is not getting hit by a car. And that's key, right? Like, people should not be getting hit by cars. Here in LA, we have a huge problem of people killing each other with their cars or killing people with their cars. There's a whole hit and run epidemic going on right now. It's nasty. So that's a big deal, right? When it comes to street safety, like, let's work so that people are not getting hit by cars. However, that's not the only kind of unsafety that someone might be experiencing in a public space. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, which was bringing all this attention to specifically how black bodies are vulnerable to racialized policing, where we really do not have, a lot of control as community residents over how police are applying laws and things like that. So they were just doing a very good job of illustrating that this was an issue of street safety, because these instances where people had been killed by police were taking place in public space. It was happening in the middle of the street. So how could those of us who were really concerned about street safety and sustainable transportation and sustainable streets, how could we not be seeing a relationship between that kind of unsafety and the work we were doing? So that was really the origin of us looking for a term that would start to explain what we meant broader than just transportation systems. Because again, when you say transportation, oftentimes what people are thinking of is the infrastructure side of it. They're thinking of, roadways, rail, all that kind of stuff. So we started using mobility because for us, that was a way of saying, we're not just talking about people who are, actively using a transportation system. We're talking about people moving through the world and what kind of conditions they're encountering. And the fact that we're not encountering the same conditions because we're not traveling in the same bodies. So, so some of the things that we see as coming together around mobility justice include racial justice issues, indigenous communities, the elderly, youth, working toward economic justice, thinking about the safety or unsafety of undocumented communities, just all the different ways that people might experience vulnerability when they're out there in our public spaces. And the theory here, for me, so if you remember going way back that I got started in this because I was interested in figuring out how to make bicycling seem better for people in LA and wanting to see how we could, move toward more sustainable transportation here. The theory is if we can actually build up this social movement or this human infrastructure around understanding the real kinds of unsafety that are out there that we need to address, then we can address them, and then we're going to get to streets where people actually do feel safe traveling in different ways without needing that protection of a private automobile, because so much of that impulse to be traveling in a private automobile here in Southern California, we really need to look at where that's coming from, the kinds of insecurity that people are living with. Maybe, they're facing housing insecurity. Maybe they're not sure they're going to be able to pay rent. Maybe, they're working 3 jobs because that's what it takes to actually, make sure that there's food on the table. Maybe they're like Cal State LA students I remember talking to who would work 1 shift at a job and then come to school and then go work a shift at a totally different job. So there's a lot of reasons that people rely on cars in this region that don't have to do with, them hating the environment or thinking that they shouldn't have more options. It's just that we have put these pressures on people that sometimes make a car the only solution that they have. So that's the difference between a mobility justice approach to sustainable transportation and a more conventional approach. So the more conventional approach to sustainable transportation would be to say, you should choose, how come you're not choosing to bike to work? How come you're not making a choice that is more sustainable? And it's more like acting like we all have an equal opportunity to make those choices. From a mobility justice standpoint, that's not true. We're actually operating with a lot of different pressures on us, and it's not the same from person to person. And what might make a safe street for one community doesn't necessarily make a safe street for another community. So just relying on design changes to streets and physical infrastructure to get us to that more safe landscape for everybody is leaving some stuff out of the picture. So these are some of the groups that I've been involved in that are working on this mobility justice idea. So here in Los Angeles, we have People for Mobility Justice, which is a group that actually got started back in 2008. We started doing outreach with Spanish-speaking bicycle users. We would post up at day laborer centers and talk to people there about their experiences riding bikes. And then we've changed our name a few times over the years. At first we were called City of Lights, and then we were called Multicultural Communities for Mobility. And then last year we became People for Mobility Justice because people were really excited about, people within the organization were really excited about taking on mobility justice intentionally as a project. So we are a very small organization. I'm one of the advisory board co-chairs, so that means I help out a lot with our financial management and supervision and things like that. We have 4 people on staff, and I'd be happy to chat with people more one-on-one if you're interested in learning about what we have going on. But we do a lot of work around bicycle safety education in English and Spanish. We also are going to be opening up a space soon to do bicycle repair services at a low-income housing facility operated by one of the state's biggest homeless service providers. So we're just always looking for ways to bring the sustainable transportation conversation into spaces where that's not necessarily what the focus is, to help make a case for giving people more options on terms that make sense to them. And then another group I'm part of is called the Untokening Collective, and that is a national group that started in 2016. Ever since then, we've had a national convening every year, and what we do in those convenings is it's a bunch of people who work in transportation and mobility, either at the government level, maybe they're like a planner with a transportation agency with a city or something like that. Maybe they work for a private firm that does transportation planning. Maybe they work for an advocacy organization. But what we have in common, besides being focused on transportation and mobility, is we're also people of color, or women, or queer folks. The kind of main way that we kind of define our community is that we're individuals who have a lived experience being part of marginalized communities. So we actually know from our own lives what it's like to not always have your streetscape designed for your needs, or to not always have the access to opportunity that you might hope that you had. And so we think it's really important for the people who are leading the conversation around transportation and mobility to be aware on that lived experience level of what our most marginalized communities are dealing with. And we call ourselves the Untokening because a lot of us have had experiences in the past of being invited into conversations or invited onto committees or things like that, and feeling that we were just there as a token, which means someone who maybe like checks a box, maybe because of your race or your gender or something like that, you are brought to the table, but then people aren't really that interested in hearing what you have to say, or they're not going to be very happy if what you have to say is different from what they already thought. So a lot of us had been through experiences like that, and so we thought, what if we could create something else? What if we could have an untokening, so we could have our own conversation about what our values are for transportation and mobility justice, without feeling like we're always having to fit into somebody else's conversation. So as I said, that's a group of people who are scattered around the country, and I'd be happy to share more about that with anybody afterwards. But that is my presentation about human infrastructure for mobility justice and what we're trying to figure out in terms of creating a sustainable transportation future that actually has undone and addressed some of those structural inequality issues that continue to be with us as we do our planning and engineering. So thank you. Questions?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned you're involved with the bike community.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still involved with the bike community?
Not really. I found the bike community to be kind of a tough space to be in. It can be very, like, there's a lot of not very niceness, if you know what I mean. I'm assuming you're part of the bike community, so you know.
I used to be a bike messenger in downtown LA,
mm-hmm.
and that whole culture was, trying to get people to use a bicycle, but then it kind of became cool,
mm-hmm.
so there was a lot of bike thefts. And that started causing a lot of divisions amongst, our own community, because the young kids were coming and stealing our stuff, and
mm-hmm.
the gangs involved and whatever. But
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's very difficult. But there's still events that go on. I don't know if you'd be interested. There's an event called Cranksgiving,
mm-hmm.
which is a bicycle fundraiser for Para los Niños.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just ride around LA, still promoting the cycling, but it is dangerous.
Because it's an alley cat, right?
Yeah, somewhat. It's not a race who gets there first. It's to get food for kids.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah.
No, you should maybe look into it again, because it's still cool. I live next to a place called the Bicycle Kitchen. Have
mm-hmm.
you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you guys want to do, right? In the community space, to let people come in and work on their bikes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still room for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, one of the big projects that I worked on during my dissertation field work, in addition to helping to start what's now People for Mobility Justice, was co-designing an event called Ciclavia. That's an open street event, and what that is they close down streets to cars a few times a year so that people can try out riding bicycles and walking. So you know about Ciclavia? So yeah, I was for a few years really like embedded in the networks of people who were, like Jimmy Lazama at the Eco Village, who co-founded the Bike Kitchen. I lived at the Eco Village, and so a lot of those people are still like my community. But in terms of promoting bicycling specifically, I feel like there definitely was this thing that occurred. So the Ciclavia event has been going on since 2010, and I think it helped to make bikes seem cool in LA in a way that didn't necessarily lead to a lot of substantive change. It's just like bikes were cool, but it's not necessarily easier to ride a bike. So what I saw happen was that the city or the politicians, became a little more friendly to having these bicycle events, but then that meant the bike community just got more like, they became more political insiders, and they haven't really been pushing for change in the same way. So I'm definitely interested in how we can work more on uplifting, the long-standing bike communities that are out there. Like in South LA and East LA, for example, there are a lot of custom bike clubs in the same way that there are custom car clubs. There are people who have these really elaborate cruiser bikes and choppers that they ride around together in parades and things like that. But that's not necessarily what you see promoted when people are promoting bicycling. Mostly what I see is kind of an image of a very like new developed area, and things that would look not out of place in any city. They don't look very specifically Los Angeles. So I think we have a ways to go here with really even like embracing our own local cultures of sustainable transportation. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
I remember you mentioned that you have a wide educational system. So the question is, are you considering other transportation vehicles such as scooters, electrical scooters, skateboards, or any other e-cycle bikes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the projects that I'm part of, more and more we've tried to shift into talking about ourselves as multimodal instead of just specifically focusing on bikes. But at the same time, mostly what I'm engaged in is the network building among people who are working in those kinds of spaces. So I don't end up interfacing very much with the kinds of mobility technologies themselves. It's more about going to be a speaker or coaching or doing education with people around the need for more engagement with communities. Before we're spending our public dollars in a neighborhood on transportation, there should be much more of a relationship and understanding of what the problems are in a neighborhood in the neighborhood residents' own terms. And usually that's something that happens much later in the process. The city might decide we're going to spend money on a project like this, and then they contract with a firm, and then they're usually far along with the project before they actually do a community engagement process. So mostly my work is on the how do we structure those kinds of things side, and not as much on the physical mobility technology side. But for sure, I think actually a lot of bicycle organizations in the last few years have been trying to figure out how to take on the broader landscape of technologies that are out there, because it's not just bicycles. And so I think people are trying to see how to build community around that. For a lot of people in the bicycle world, those newer technologies were seen as a threat, and I think may still be seen as a threat because and I think this is something that is legitimate. When you're talking about these electrical, small scale, micromobility technologies, you are introducing a battery, you're introducing a lot of stuff that is going to end up becoming e-waste that you don't have if you're just talking about mobility devices like a bicycle, where the person is the source of the energy that's making it move. So there are, I think, some concerns about how, when we don't talk about, like, for example, there's the term zero emissions often gets used to describe micromobility technologies. And if we dig into that a little deeper, I think we'll find that that's actually not true, that there's a lot of emissions involved in producing those technologies and getting them to the cities where they're being used. And so I think we need to consider having a more life cycle analysis of how we're using resources. But for sure, more and more people are recognizing on the advocacy side that the safety issues someone on a scooter might be dealing with are very similar to the safety issues someone on a bicycle would be dealing with. I think we may be at time. Do we end at 1 o'clock? Yeah, so if anybody else has questions, feel free to ask. I'm going to go ahead and finish my sandwich here. But thanks so much for having me.